The autumn sun glinted off Richard Sullivan's Bentley as it idled at the red light on Fifth Avenue. Inside, his manicured fingers drummed impatiently against Italian leather, gold cufflinks catching the light with each movement. Beyond the tinted windows, New York City buzzed with its usual frenetic energy, a world he observed but rarely touched. Richard checked his Patek Philippe watch. Another board meeting in 30 minutes, where he'd likely fire another dozen employees to boost next quarter's profits. A small tap on his window broke his concentration. Richard's first instinct was annoyance, another panhandler interrupting his thoughts. But when he glanced over, he saw not a beggar, but a boy, perhaps 10 years old, with dark hair badly in need of a trim and clothes that hung from his thin frame like laundry on a line. The child's eyes, however, told a different story, determined, steady, and somehow familiar. "Dad," the boy mouthed through the glass. Richard's throat tightened. A mistake, clearly. He shook his head, about to motion the driver to move. Along as the light changed, when the boy pulled something from his tattered jacket, a yellowed folded piece of paper held forward with both hands like an offering. "My mom told me to give you this if I ever found you," the boy said, his voice muffled through the glass. Something in Richard's chest constricted. Against his better judgment, he lowered the window. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice unnaturally tight. "Bobby," the boy replied, standing straighter, as if the name itself gave him dignity. The name hit Richard like a physical blow. Barbara Bobby had loved that name. She'd mentioned it once during a weekend in the Hamptons, a lifetime ago. "And your mother?" Richard asked, already knowing, already dreading. "Barbara Wilson," Bobby answered, with the practiced certainty of someone who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. The letter trembled in the boy's outstretched hand. On the outside, in careful handwriting that Richard recognized instantly, were the words, "Dad, if you're reading this." Richard's world tilted on its axis. With fingers suddenly clumsy, he took the letter and unfolded it. 2 simple lines stared back at him. "If you're reading this, Richard, I'm gone. He's yours. I never stopped believing you'd find each other. Take care of him like I no longer can." Richard looked up, truly seeing the boy for the first time. The curve of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, the furrow between his brows that Richard himself saw in the mirror every morning. The traffic behind them honked impatiently. "Get in," Richard said. The Sullivan penthouse had never felt so cavernous, so empty, as it did with Bobby standing in its center. The boy took everything in with quiet dignity. The abstract art, the minimalist furniture, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, while keeping his hands carefully at his sides, as if afraid to touch anything. "Are you hungry?" Richard asked, realizing he had no idea what to do with the child. Bobby nodded, his eyes never leaving Richard's face. "A little." The refrigerator yielded nothing but champagne, mineral water, and takeout containers from restaurants whose names Bobby couldn't pronounce. Richard ordered pizza instead, watching as the boy ate methodically, savoring each bite as if unsure when he'd eat again. That night, after showing Bobby to the guest room with its pristine white sheets, Richard sat in his study, the letter spread before him like evidence from a crime scene. He opened his safe and pulled out a small wooden box he hadn't touched in years. Inside lay the artifacts of a life he'd abandoned, movie ticket stubs, a braided leather bracelet, and photographs of a smiling woman with auburn hair and laughing eyes. Barbara. The woman he'd sworn to marry someday. The woman who'd told him she was pregnant 11 years ago and whom he'd accused of trying to trap him. The woman whose calls he'd blocked, whose letters he'd returned unopened. The woman who, according to the meager information Bobby had shared, had died of cancer 3 months ago. Richard poured himself a scotch and stared at Barbara's handwriting until the letters blurred. "What have I done?" he whispered to the empty room. If you are enjoying the story, type 5 in the comments and subscribe for more videos like this. If not, type 0. It helps me create even better content for you. Continuing. Morning brought chaos in the form of Charlotte Blackwell, Richard's girlfriend of 2 years, arriving unannounced with plans for their weekend in the Hamptons. "Who is this?" she demanded, perfectly manicured nails tapping against her designer handbag as she stared at Bobby, who was eating cereal at the kitchen. "Island?" Richard pulled her into his study, closing the door behind them. "His name is Bobby. He's my son." Charlotte's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to cold fury in the span of seconds. "You're what? Since when do you have a son?" "Since 11 years ago," Richard admitted. "I didn't know until yesterday." "This is ridiculous," Charlotte hissed. "It's obviously a scam. Some woman sees dollar signs and sends her kid with a sob story." "Barbara is dead," Richard interrupted. "Cancer. And he has my eyes, Charlotte, my father's chin. He's mine." Charlotte's face hardened. "So you're just going to take in some street urchin on blind faith? What about DNA tests? What about our life, our plans?" Their argument escalated, voices rising until they became aware of a small figure standing in the doorway. Bobby watched them with old eyes in a young face, his expression carefully neutral. "I can go," he said quietly. "I just wanted to give you Mum's letter." The simple dignity in those words made Richard feel 2 inches tall. "No," he said firmly. "You're staying. This is your home now." Charlotte grabbed her purse. "Call me when you come to your senses," she snapped, brushing past Bobby without a glance. The penthouse fell silent after the slam of the door. "She doesn't like me," Bobby observed. "She doesn't know you," Richard replied, surprising himself with the protective instinct suddenly flaring in his chest. The first week felt like navigating a minefield in the dark. Richard cancelled meetings, rescheduled calls, and tried to learn the basics of fatherhood through frantic Google searches and whispered phone calls to his assistant. Bobby needed everything: clothes, school supplies, a pediatrician, proper meals. Each shopping trip revealed new gaps in Richard's understanding of his son. Bobby stared in confusion at the array of options, overwhelmed by choices after years of having none. "Just pick whatever you want," Richard said at a department store, gesturing at rows of children's clothes. Bobby touched a simple blue t-shirt, checking the price tag before putting it back. "That's too expensive." Richard felt something crack inside him. "Nothing is too expensive," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Nothing." At night, Richard would peek into the guest room, now Bobby's room, and watch his son sleep, curled tightly on one side of the king-sized bed, as if afraid to take up too much space. During those quiet moments, Richard allowed himself to feel the full weight of his abandonment, the years lost, the milestones missed. He called his lawyer. "I need to legally establish paternity and file for full custody," he said, "whatever it takes." "It won't be simple," his lawyer warned. "Without the mother, with no prior relationship—" "He's my son," Richard interrupted. "Make it happen." That evening, as they ate dinner at the massive dining table that had never before hosted a family meal, Bobby looked up suddenly. "Mom used to talk about you," he said. "She kept your picture." Richard set down his fork. "What did she tell you?" "That you were smart, and that you'd come through someday." Bobby pushed his food around his plate. "She wasn't mad at you, not even at the end." Richard excused himself to the bathroom, where he pressed his forehead against the cool marble wall and tried to breathe through the vice squeezing his chest. Will Richard ever truly earn Bobby's trust? Or will his past mistakes continue to haunt their fragile new relationship? The shadows of betrayal run deep, but sometimes the brightest light comes from the darkest places. The corporate empire Richard had built demanded his attention. He brought Bobby to his office, setting him up in a conference room with books. and a tablet while he attended an emergency board meeting. "Sullivan, this acquisition can't wait," barked Harrington, the CFO. "We need your full attention." Richard found himself staring through the glass wall at Bobby, who sat quietly drawing, small legs dangling from the oversized chair. "We'll discuss this tomorrow," Richard said, closing his portfolio. "This isn't like you," Harrington muttered as Richard left. "You never put anything before business." The comment followed Richard like a ghost. It wasn't like him. The Richard Sullivan of 2 weeks ago wouldn't recognize the man who now spent evenings helping with math homework and weekends at the Museum of Natural History. Charlotte resurfaced. Her initial anger cooled into calculation. She invited herself over, bringing a gift for Bobby, an expensive gaming console that lit up his face with pure joy. "See, I can adapt," she told Richard later, voice honey-sweet. "We can make this work, the three of us." But when Bobby left the room, her smile faded. "I've spoken with my cousin at Child Services," she whispered. "Your situation is precarious. No documentation, no relationship with the child, a demanding career. I could help your case as a stable female presence." The threat was subtle but clear. Support her vision of their future, or she'd become an obstacle to his custody of Bobby. That night, Richard found Bobby sitting on his bedroom floor, a small cardboard box open before him. Inside lay his meager possessions, a baseball card, a smooth stone, a dog-eared book, and a small frame photo of Barbara. "She was pretty," Richard said, sitting beside him. Bobby nodded. "She worked at 2 jobs, sometimes 3. He touched the photo gently. "She got sick last year, but kept working until she couldn't anymore." Richard thought of Barbara's determination, her pride, her refusal to ask him for help, even as she raised their child alone. The shame was a living thing inside him. "I should have been there," he said. Bobby looked up. "You're here now." The simple absolution in those words burned worse than any accusation. The media caught wind of the story 3 weeks in. Richard arrived at his building to find photographers crowding the entrance. Bobby pressed against his side, face hidden. "Sullivan heir appears from nowhere," screamed the business pages. "Billionaire's secret love child," splashed across tabloids. Charlotte used the publicity to her advantage, appearing sympathetic in carefully staged photos. Behind closed doors, her patience thinned. "This is taking too long," she complained. "The novelty will wear off, Richard. Children always do." Richard found himself withdrawing from her, her presence grating where it once soothed. She noticed. "You've changed," she accused. "Yes," Richard agreed simply. Social services conducted their home evaluation. Ms. Patel, the caseworker, observed Richard and Bobby with sharp eyes. "What happens when the demands of your work conflict with his needs?" she asked bluntly. Before Richard could answer, Bobby spoke up. "He helps me with homework every night," he said, "even when his phone keeps ringing." Ms. Patel smiled slightly. "And what about friends, Bobby? School?" Bobby's shoulders hunched. "I don't know anybody here." Richard realized with a jolt that he'd been so focused on legal matters and logistics that he'd neglected Bobby's social needs. The boy had gone from a neighborhood where everyone knew him to complete isolation. That weekend, Richard took Bobby to Brooklyn, to a neighborhood park where children Bobby's age played basketball. Bobby watched longingly from the sidelines until Richard gently nudged him forward. "Go on," he encouraged. "Ask if you can play." "What if they say no?" Bobby whispered. Richard knelt to eye level. "Then we find another game, but they might say yes." Bobby hesitated, then walked toward the court. A minute of conversation later, he was passing the ball, his face breaking into the first genuine smile Richard had seen. Watching from the bench, Richard didn't notice Charlotte approaching until she sat beside him. "I've filed for temporary custody," she said without preamble. "As a concerned party, the hearing is next week." Richard stared at her, ice forming in his veins. "What?" "You're not thinking clearly," she said. "This child has disrupted everything. I'm helping you see reason." As Bobby made his first basket, the other kids cheering him on, Richard felt something crystallize inside him, a clarity he hadn't known in years. "We're done, Charlotte," he said quietly. "Completely done." Her eyes narrowed. "You'll regret this, Richard. When the shine wears off playing daddy, you'll realize what you've thrown away." She walked away, her parting shot hanging in the air between them. "See you in court." What will it cost Richard to truly become the father Bobby needs? With everything on the line and enemies closing in, the real battle is only beginning. The morning of the custody hearing dawned grey and cold. Richard helped Bobby with his tie, a miniature version of his own, their reflections side by side in the mirror. "What happens if we lose?" Bobby asked, voice small. Richard turned him gently by the shoulders. "We won't lose. But no matter what happens in that courtroom, I will always be your father. Always." The courthouse corridors echoed with their footsteps. Charlotte was already there, dressed conservatively, her lawyer whispering in her ear. She'd brought reinforcements. Richard's former assistant, a business partner, even his doorman, all prepared to testify about his workaholic tendencies, his temper, his unsuitability as a parent. Richard's own lawyer looked grim. "They're painting you as a negligent father who suddenly wants to play house," she whispered. "And they have affidavits from people who've known you for years." The judge, an older woman with steel-grey hair and piercing eyes, reviewed the documents before her with an unreadable expression. "Mr. Sullivan," she finally said, "your situation is unusual. You have no legal relationship with this child, no prior parenting experience, and a career that demands extraordinary commitment." Richard felt the floor tilting beneath him. "However," she continued, "I also see substantial efforts to adjust. Your life, appropriate provisions for the child's care, and a clear biological connection." She turned to Bobby. "Young man, I'd like to speak with you privately in my chambers." The 15 minutes that Bobby spent with the judge were the longest of Richard's life. When they returned, Bobby's expression gave nothing away. The judge returned to her seat. "Mr. Sullivan, I've reached my decision." But before she could continue, the courtroom doors burst open. An elderly woman in a wheelchair was pushed forward by a court officer, Maria, Barbara's mother, Bobby's grandmother, whom Richard had never met. "I apologize for the interruption, Your Honor," Maria said, her voice strong despite her frail appearance. "I've been in hospital, but I have something the court should see." She handed an envelope to the bailiff. Inside was a letter from Barbara, dated just weeks before her death, legally designating Richard as Bobby's guardian. "My daughter never stopped believing he would step up," Maria said, looking directly at Richard for the first time. "Neither did I." The letter changed everything. The judge granted Richard full custody with regular visitation for Maria. Outside the courthouse, in the weak autumn sunlight, Richard knelt and pulled Bobby into a fierce hug. "We did it, son." Over Bobby's shoulder, he saw Charlotte leave, without a backward glance, but Maria remained, watching them with complicated emotions playing across her weathered face. Richard stood and approached her. "Thank you," he said simply. She nodded once. "I didn't do it for you, but maybe—" She glanced at Bobby. "Maybe we can all be family now." For the first time since Bobby had appeared at his car window, Richard felt the fist around his heart begin to loosen. Winter descended on New York, transforming the city into a snow globe of possibilities. Richard and Bobby established routines. Breakfast together every morning, homework at the dining table, bedtime stories that grew longer each night. Maria became a regular presence, bringing home-cooked meals and stories about Barbara that made Bobby laugh and Richard ache with the knowledge of all he'd missed. She used to sing in the shower, Maria told them one evening. Terrible voice, but so happy. Bobby nodded eagerly. She did the dishes dancing too. Richard absorbed these details like a man dying of thirst. Every new revelation about Barbara was precious. Her love of old movies, her habit of reading the end of books first, the way she'd saved every drawing Bobby had ever made. At work, Richard implemented changes that shocked his board. Flexible hours, remote work options, improved parental leave. "We should build a company that values families," he told them, "including our own." He brought Bobby to the office. Holiday party, proudly introducing him to everyone. Harrington watched them with narrowed eyes. "Sullivan Industries isn't a family charity," he warned later. "The board is getting nervous about your divided focus." Richard smiled thinly. "Then perhaps the board needs new vision." Harrington's implied threat lingered, but Richard found he cared less each day about the empire that had once defined him. The true revelation came when Bobby's school called. He'd gotten into a fight, defending a smaller boy from bullies. Richard left a crucial meeting without explanation to pick him up. Sitting in the principal's office, Bobby's eyes swelling, Richard felt not disappointment, but fierce pride. "You stood up for someone who needed help," he said as they walked home through light snow. "That matters more than any trouble it caused." Bobby looked up, surprised. "You're not mad?" "I'm proud," Richard corrected. "There are worse things than getting in trouble for the right reasons." That night, they built a fort of blankets in the living room and watched old movies until Bobby fell asleep against Richard's shoulder. Looking down at his son's sleeping face, Richard felt a completeness he'd never known existed. Have you ever had your life completely transformed by an unexpected arrival, or known someone whose priorities were suddenly reordered by love? I'd love to hear your story in the comments. Spring brought new challenges. Bobby struggled with math, his frustration building until he slammed his textbook shut one evening. "I'm stupid," he muttered. "Mom was smart about numbers. I'm not." Richard sat beside him. "Your mother was a bookkeeper who balanced accounts to the penny," he said gently. "I build financial models that predict market behavior. You come from smart stock, buddy. You're just learning." They worked through problems together, Richard discovering a patience he never knew he possessed. When Bobby finally grasped the concept, his triumphant smile was worth every difficult minute. Maria's health declined, requiring more of Richard's attention. He reorganized his schedule, taking Bobby to visit her regularly at her small apartment in Queens. "You didn't have to come," she said one afternoon, oxygen tubes trailing from her nose. "I know how busy you are." Richard shook his head. "We wanted to come. Your family." The word hung between them. An offering, an acknowledgement, a promise. Bobby thrived with the stability of their new life, growing inches in mere months, his laughter coming more easily. He joined a baseball team, Richard attending every game and practice. He made friends at school, boys who soon filled the penthouse with noise and energy on weekends. Charlotte resurfaced at a charity gala, approaching Richard with practiced nonchalance. "You look content," she said, the words sounding like an accusation. Richard nodded. "I am." "The board misses your killer instinct," she continued. "Harrington says you've gone soft." "Harrington's welcome to my job if he wants it," Richard replied, surprising himself with how much he meant it. Charlotte studied him. "You really have changed. For the better, I hope." Richard checked his watch. "If you'll excuse me, I promised Bobby I'd be home by 9. As he left, he felt lighter without the weight of Charlotte's expectations, the burden of being the man he'd thought he needed to be. Summer arrived with sweltering heat and the anniversary of Barbara's death. Bobby grew quiet, withdrawn, spending hours staring at her photograph. "Would you like to visit her?" Richard asked gently. Bobby nodded, not trusting his voice. They flew to Chicago, where Barbara was buried. Standing before her simple headstone, Richard felt the full weight of his absence. From her life, from her death, from the years of struggle she'd faced. Alone. Bobby placed wildflowers on the grave. She liked yellow ones best. Richard knelt beside him. "Bobby, I need to tell you something. When your mother told me she was pregnant with you, I didn't believe her. I walked away when she needed me most." His voice broke. "I want you to know how sorry I am, not just to her, but to you." Bobby was quiet for a long moment. "Mom said you were scared." Richard looked up, surprised. "She said sometimes people make mistakes when they're scared, but it doesn't mean they're bad people." Bobby traced the letters of his mother's name on the stone. "She wasn't mad at you. She said you'd find your way back." Richard pulled Bobby into his arms, his son's forgiveness more than he deserved, but exactly what he needed. That night, in their hotel room, Bobby handed Richard a small, worn journal. "Mom wrote this for you. She said to give it to you when I thought you were ready." Richard's hands trembled as he opened it. Inside were years of Barbara's thoughts, her struggle, her unwavering faith in Bobby, and somehow, impossibly, her forgiveness of Richard. The last entry, dated just weeks before her death, read, "If he finds you, Bobby, it means he's finally ready to be the man I always believed he could be. Trust him. He'll love you enough for both of us now." Will Richard honor Barbara's final wish and become the father she always believed he could be? As dark forces gather to challenge their newfound happiness, the ultimate test of their bond approaches. Returning to New York, Richard and Bobby faced their greatest challenge yet. Harrington, seizing an opportunity during Richard's absence, had convinced the board to vote on a restructuring plan, one that would effectively remove Richard from day-to-day operations. "It's nothing personal," Harrington explained with false sympathy. "Your priorities have shifted. The company needs leadership that's undistracted." Richard squared his shoulders, prepared for a fight, when Bobby's school called. His son had collapsed during gym class, severe appendicitis requiring emergency surgery. Without hesitation, Richard walked out of the board meeting. "Do what you have to do," he told Harrington. "My son needs me." The hospital corridors seemed endless as Richard ran toward the pediatric ward. Bobby looked tiny in the hospital bed, pale and frightened. "Dad," he whispered, reaching out. Richard took his hand. "I'm here, buddy. Everything's going to be okay." For 14 hours, Richard didn't leave Bobby's side. Through surgery, recovery, and the first tentative steps of healing, he slept in an uncomfortable chair, made calls from the corridor, and learned more about appendectomy recovery than he'd ever thought possible. When he finally checked his messages, they were filled with news of his professional demise. Harrington had succeeded. The board had voted Richard into an advisory role. His empire was slipping through his fingers. Maria visited, bringing homemade soup and quiet support. "You can fight back," she said, watching him read through legal documents at Bobby's bedside. "You built that company." Richard looked at Bobby, sleeping peacefully. "Some things are worth fighting for," he said. "Others just aren't as important as I thought." Days later, as Bobby recovered at home, Richard made his decision. He called his lawyer. "I want to sell my controlling interest in Sullivan Industries," he said, "but with conditions." The news broke the following week. Richard Sullivan, corporate titan, was stepping down. His shares would be sold to a collective that included long-term employees and a foundation established in Barbara Wilson's name. Harrington was livid. "You're throwing away everything you built," Richard smiled. "No, I'm building something better." Autumn returned, bringing with it Bobby's 12th birthday, the penthouse filled with friends, family, and laughter. Maria presided from her wheelchair, directing the celebration with joyful authority despite her declining health. Richard watched Bobby blow out candles, surrounded by friends, and felt a profound sense of rightness. The past year had transformed them both. Bobby had grown taller, more confident, his eyes no longer holding the wariness of a child expecting to be abandoned. Richard had grown too, softer in some ways, stronger in others. After the party, as they cleared wrapping paper, Maria beckoned Richard closer. "Barbara would be proud," she said, her voice weaker than even a week before, "of both of you." "I wish she could see him," Richard said quietly. "See us." Maria patted his hand. "She knew who you could become. That's why she made sure Bobby would find you." Later that night, after Bobby had fallen asleep amid his new treasures, Richard found himself drawn to the balcony. The city spread before him, lights twinkling in the darkness. His phone buzzed, Harrington, still trying to lure him back, with promises of power and position. Richard declined the call without hesitation. His new venture, a foundation supporting single parents, demanded attention, but not at the expense of his family. He had learned to create boundaries, to define success on his own terms. The sound of the balcony door sliding open broke his reverie. Bobby stood there, hair rumpled from sleep. "Couldn't sleep?" Richard asked. Bobby shook his head. "I had a dream about Mom." She was smiling. Richard put his arm around his son's shoulders. "She loved you very much." "She loved you too," Bobby said simply, "even when you weren't there." The words hit Richard with physical force, the unearned grace of it, the legacy of a woman who had believed in him when he'd given her no reason to. "I want to be worthy of that," Richard said, his voice rough with emotion. "Of her faith in me, of you." Bobby leaned against him. "You already are, Dad." In that moment, on a balcony above the city where he'd once ruled with cold ambition, Richard Sullivan found himself humbled by the simple trust of his son. Winter came again, harsh and beautiful. Maria's health failed rapidly, her fierce spirit finally yielding to her failing body. Richard and Bobby spent Christmas in the hospital, bringing decorations to her room, singing carols badly but with enthusiasm. "You two," she whispered, smiling weakly. "What a pair you make." When she died 3 days later, Bobby cried in Richard's arms, a child's grief pure and unrestrained. Richard held him, offering the comfort he'd learned to give, understanding now that strength wasn't the absence of tears, but the courage to feel them fully. At the funeral, Richard was surprised by the number of people who came. Barbara's friends, neighbors, co-workers, people who spoke of her kindness, her determination, her joy. "She talked about you," an older woman told Richard. "Said you'd find each other someday, her boy and his father." The words stayed with him as he and Bobby created new rituals to honor both Barbara and Maria. Sunday visits to the cemetery, stories shared over dinner, a scholarship fund in their names. Charlotte appeared at a fundraiser for Richard's foundation, visibly uncomfortable but determined. "I was wrong," she said without preamble. "About you, about Bobby." Richard nodded, accepting her apology without rancor. "People change." "You certainly did," she agreed, looking around at the event. Parents and children, representatives from family support organizations, educators and advocates. For the better. As spring approached, Bobby came to Richard with a request that took him by surprise. "I want to change my name," he said. "Not my whole name, just my last name, to Sullivan." Richard felt his throat tighten. "Are you sure? Wilson is your mother's name." Bobby nodded solemnly. "Mom would understand. I want people to know I'm your son." The legal paperwork was simple compared to the emotional significance. When the judge made it official, Robert Wilson Sullivan, Richard felt he'd been given a gift beyond measure. "I think," he told Bobby as they left the courthouse, "this calls for ice cream." Bobby grinned. "Mom always said celebrations need ice cream." Hand in hand, they walked through the park, two Sullivans finding their way together. 1 year, to the day after Bobby had appeared at Richard's car window, they stood together in the kitchen making pancakes, a Saturday tradition they'd established. Bobby carefully flipped a perfectly golden circle, his technique improving weekly. "Dad," he said suddenly, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't found you that day?" Richard paused, the question hitting him with unexpected force. "I try not to," he admitted. "The thought of missing this, missing you, is too painful." Bobby nodded, considering this as he poured more batter. "I was scared you wouldn't want me." "And now?" Richard asked softly. Bobby smiled, Barbara's smile, open and genuine. "Now, I know better." The penthouse that had once showcased Richard's success now told a different story. Bobby's artwork on the refrigerator, family photos on the walls, Maria's Afghan thrown over the couch. Signs of a life built on love rather than achievement. Richard's new ventures thrived, the foundation growing beyond his expectations, his consulting work allowing him the flexibility to prioritize Bobby. The corporate world that had once consumed him now occupied just a fraction of his attention. That evening, they visited Barbara's favorite spot in Central Park, information gleaned from her journal. Sitting on a bench overlooking the lake, Richard watched Bobby skip stones. Across the water, his lanky frame outlined against the setting sun. "She knew," Richard said quietly, more to himself than to Bobby. "She knew I needed you more than you needed me." Bobby looked back, his expression suddenly so like his mother's that Richard's breath caught. "We needed each other, Dad." And, in that simple truth, Richard found the peace he'd been seeking his entire life, not in boardrooms or bank accounts, but in the miracle of second chances. In a boy who had appeared at his window with a letter that began, "Dad, if you're reading this." A letter that had broken him open and made him whole. Richard Sullivan, once defined by wealth and power, now measured his worth by the trust in his son's eyes, by pancakes on Saturday mornings, by a love that had found him when he didn't deserve it and transformed him into the man he was always meant to be. "Race you home?" Bobby called, already running. Richard laughed and followed, chasing not ambition or success, but the only future that mattered. One with his son at the center. Congratulations, type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel.